Good morning. Thanks for joining us on this third day of the Almond Conference. I'm Gabrielle Ludwig, Director for Sustainability and Environmental Affairs at the Almond Board of California. This morning's sessions will provide some reminders or tips on some key IPM practices related to some of our key insects and disease issues. And just a reminder, this is a pre-recorded session, but you can ask questions to the presenters via the chat box, and they will be available throughout this session until noon to address questions in writing. You may be able to, though I don't want to promise it, to also follow up with questions via the lounge in the lobby section. For those of you wanting CEU credits, you need to have registered and followed those instructions, and at the end you also need to check in and take the quiz to obtain the credit. Now to the speakers. I'm not sure that any of them need introductions, but just a reminder. Jim Addiscalf, which is a plant pathologist at UC Riverside, who has been working with managing diseases in almonds and other tree crops for many years. David Haviland has also been around for a while. He's an entomology farm advisor in Kern County. And Mohammed Yakmour is still relatively new, but he's also been working with almonds and other tree crops in Kern County as the farm advisor there. With that, I will hand it over to Jim to get us started.
Well, hello there. This is David Haviland with the University of California Cooperative Extension in Kern County. And I've been asked today to give an update on entomology, and in particular to give a quick tips type presentation. Not going to show a whole lot of data today, but more so give some recommendations for things that can be done to promote integrated pest management, and some of the background of why we actually do those things. So just to start off, as you can imagine, we're going to focus on navel orangworm. That is the arch nemesis every year of you as an almond grower. Now, the first point to make with navel orangworm is that there is no silver bullet. You absolutely have to have a program. So that is sanitation in combination with monitoring and insecticides, harvesting as early or as quickly as you can, and then mating disruption. So all that together. And this is a case where this adage of you have to spend money to make money is very appropriate. You can't just put your head in the sand on navel orangworm and hope that everything's going to be okay. Because some years it might be, but in most years it won't be. So you got to be aggressive on this one. Now the basics, the standard for decades we've known that the cornerstone of an IPM program is sanitation. You've probably heard a lot about it over the years, and I'm going to talk about it again. At minimum, every single grower in California, every almond grower in the winter should be dormant, shaking the trees, blowing those nuts to the middle, windrowing them, and mowing them. I say mow, but disking, whatever you need to do to destroy those nuts. Hey, everybody should be doing that at minimum. Now, on top of that, in an ideal scenario, the trees will also get pulled. The goal is less than 2 mummies per tree. And what's happening here is you're doing two things. You're reducing the number of moths, but really where you're making your money with the sanitation is by preventing places for eggs to be laid. So I just want to sort of do a little bit of a back of a napkin summary to the right here. Just think about this scenario. If you're down to 2 mummies per tree, if 10% of those are infested, you assume that half of any worms in there are going to be females. And each of those females, when it comes out, is going to make 85 eggs. Okay, so just roughly look at that scenario. If that's the case, within an acre, you're going to have 10 females that are all coming out at different times, that are all competing to lay 850 eggs, and they're trying to do that in 200 nuts in a way that's completely uncoordinated. Okay, they're also trying to find mates in the process. And if you think about it, each one of those females, in order to lay 85 eggs, they have to find a nut in a tree, lay an egg. Fly around the tree, find another nut, lay an egg. Fly to a whole another tree, find a nut, lay an egg, and so on. Okay? They literally have to fly to 42 different trees to lay 1 egg in each nut if you're down to 2 nuts per tree. So, all that's being done uncoordinated. Of course, sometimes they're flying back to the same nut. Sometimes there's a nut that isn't even suitable. Sometimes there's already an egg in that nut. You're just creating chaos when you can get under 2 mummies per tree. And when you think about it, any egg that you prevent from being laid in May is one less moth at hull split. That's what you're really trying to prevent. So sanitation is extremely important, and we do recommend that everybody do their best attempt. Now with that, we of course have economics. So I'm just going to summarize by saying that we want to balance those economics. Okay? On one hand, sanitation is the most effective management strategy that you have control over. But I'll also recognize good sanitation can cost you more than all of the other practices combined. Okay? So I'm not going to pretend that every grower should be doing the full sanitation. At minimum, everybody should be doing what I've listed here at minimum. And many, if not most growers should be trying to get down to 2 mummies per tree. But of course, you do have to balance the economics in that. Now, second thing I'm going to focus on with navel orangeworm is main disruption, because this really is the future. Now, the aerosols out there, or I'm going to go through the different options. Okay, first of all, there's aerosols. Okay, these are typically put out at 1 per acre now. And as a grower or someone you contract is going to install those and remove them. Okay, there's also meso emitters. Those are approximately 20 per acre. They get hung in the spring, but you don't have to take them back down. You just leave them there. There's also flowables. These are products or a product that you spray onto the tree. It is registered, but I'm just going to say it's still under evaluation for efficacy. We've done 2 years of trials right now, and we've been able to show some effects on captures, but thus far we haven't shown any definitive effect on reducing actual damage. So that's all I'm going to say on flowables, just that they're registered, but not going to focus on them. I'm going to focus on the aerosols and mesos for the rest of this talk, because that's where we have data showing that they're effective. Now, those products are available by 4 companies. So that's Cetera, Pacific Biocontrol, Semios, and Trace. And I'll just say that there's a product for everybody. If you're a do-it-yourself person, there's products you can buy and kind of do it all. If you're one of those people that wants to write a check and walk away, likewise, there's some of these companies that provide full service plus bonuses kinds of programs where they'll just take care of everything for you. Now, as far as efficacy, the first thing I want to talk about is what is the ideal condition for using mating disruption? Ideally, you want to have at least 40 acres, okay, or a minimum of 40 acres. Ideally, you're going to be in the 100 acres or more range. That's where you're going to get the best benefit. You want the place that's using mating disruption to be in the square to rectangular shape. As you can see, this 40-acre block on the right. And ideally, you're going to be in a situation where you can control your own navel orangeworm destiny. And what I mean by that is you're not at risk of having a whole bunch of moths flying in from somewhere else that are already mated. Okay, if you're a 20-acre grower in an ocean of pistachios that aren't sanitized, mating disruption is not going to help you. Okay, but if your almonds, either you're your own neighbor or your neighbors are doing a good job or your neighbors aren't almonds, that's going to help you out. And then I'll say light breezes are ideal. Okay? We don't want no wind, because then the pheromone just sort of sits around the dispensers. But you also don't want 40-mile-an-hour winds either. Otherwise, your mating disruption product is going to be benefiting your almond neighbor. Now, does mating disruption work? So we did some efficacy studies in 2017, and I'll summarize those in one slide. You can see here the blue bar. We average about 2.5% damage in the untreated. And then the products Cetera, from Cetera, Semios, Pacific Biocontrol, and Trace, all 4 of those gave us right in the 50% reduction in damage range. So from my standpoint as a University of California sort of external person that's evaluating these products, they all work, they all have similar efficacy. Now, on the right-hand side is the summary of 9 different trials that we did in the Southern Valley and the Northern San Joaquin Valley, myself and Jalinda Rajal. And you can see here the reductions in damage in the nonpareils and the reductions in damage in the pollinizers in the black and white chart on the left side. You can see more than 50% reduction in damage across all those sites. You can see the error bars also. So that's fairly consistent. And this, by the way, is all the sites that met those previous criteria on the last slide for being good sites to use mating disruption. On the right, this is a kernels evaluation. This is a little different than what you're used to seeing, but this is the actual weight per acre of nuts that were damaged by navel orangeworm. This goes across all the varieties. So you can see here, this was reduced by more than 50%. The numbers here are in kilograms of kernels per hectare, but that's basically the same number as pounds per acre. So where main disruption was used on average, we went from 60 pounds down to 20 pounds of nuts that were damaged by navel orangworm. Now, where's the break even? So what I've done here for all those studies is made a chart on break evenness, if you want to call it that. What it showed is that in our 2017 study, if you did not use mating disruption and you had 0.83% damage, that was the break even. Okay? In our 2017 to 2018 studies, those 9 sites I described, the break even was 1% damage, okay, 1.06. And again, that's 1% in the untreated check in the USDA grade number. Okay, so what does that mean? So if you're someone that didn't use mating disruption, okay, let's ignore the research trials now. Let's talk about your fields. Okay? If you had an almond orchard this year and you did not use mating disruption on it, okay, and it's a square, it's at least 40 acres and so on. If you had less than 1% damage in that orchard, if you had bought mating disruption, you would have lost money on the deal. Okay, what you paid for it would have been less than what you made. If you had 1% damage in that orchard without mating disruption, you would have broken even by using mating disruption. And if you had more than 1% damage, you would have made money had you invested in a mating disruption system in hindsight. Okay. Now on the right-hand side, what if you did use mating disruption? All of the data show that if your USDA grade sheet in that field was under 0.5%, what you spent on mating disruption was more than what you got out of it. Okay? If you had 0.5% damage, you broke even. And if you had more than 0.5% damage, you would have made money by investing mating disruption. Okay? You would have had twice as much damage without it, and the differences in those made the difference in paying for it. Now, other things to consider with regards to mating disruption, just to let you know, there's no way to predict good years and bad years. So you got to see mating disruption as an insurance policy. Okay, but in our trials, in 6 out of 6 sites where we had 2 years of mating disruption, we saw a benefit. It paid for itself. There's also value to resistance management programs. There's also more efficiency at the processor with less damage. You've got less aflatoxins anytime there's less damage. You've got the marketing value of being sustainable. Plus, there's year-over-year benefits that are traditionally shown in mating disruption systems across a lot of different pests. And there's a potential to reduce sprays. We haven't really tested that with just a couple of sites so far, but if you're someone that sprays twice every year and doesn't use mating disruption, there's that opportunity that you could use mating disruption but spray only once. That way you're potentially offsetting the cost of mating disruption but still getting acceptable damage with its use. So all things considered, mating disruption is real. It is a viable part of the future. We're not going to get any new insecticides anytime soon. So anything we can do to take the pressure off those, but still manage navel orangworm sustainability is a good thing. Okay, moving on to spider mites. So I've been asked to talk more specifically about treatment thresholds and biocontrol as it has to do with the almond sustainability program that the industry is putting together. So as background, the treatment thresholds that are recommended were established back in 1984. A long time ago by Frank Zalem and Wilson. That data said 22% of the leaves are infested and there's no biocontrol. In that time it was predatory mites. You should treat. If there's biocontrol present, 43.6% of the leaves infested suggests a treatment is needed. And there's a sheet you see on the right here available on the UC IPM program that walks you through that if you want to use those thresholds, which are good. That form outlines a sequential sampling plan where you look at 15 leaves, presence, absence, you mark it on the form, do that on another tree, do another tree, and essentially look at the thresholds regarding whether or not you have biocontrol present. It's pretty quick, it's pretty easy. It's not necessary to do it every week. Of course, if you have no mites, don't waste your time on the form. If your tree's webbed over, likewise, you don't need to. But in those key weeks where you're deciding if a treatment is needed, I think it's worth the time because you can save a lot of money by not treating using these thresholds. Now, we did some efforts to relook at these thresholds. So as I said, 1984 was a long time ago, and we realize a lot has changed since then. So we looked at 12 different orchards over the past decades, tracked the mites over time, and at each site we synchronized the numbers based on, we used 1.4 mites per leaf. We called that day zero, and then we calibrated all the other data as weeks before or weeks after that day zero. And you can see the chart here. So what we did is we made a line. We just said, okay, here's this diagonal line. We identified that point right there and said, that's when a treatment should be made. Okay, anything below that's no big deal. And you can see after that point is when things start getting ugly. That's what we want to prevent. Now we recognize it takes about a week on average from the day you decide to treat until the day a treatment is made. So we came back a week and we took a look at what that number is. What we found out was you should decide to treat if there's 1.4 mites per leaf to prevent the population from getting to 5.4 per leaf, to therefore prevent economic losses, which are well above that point somewhere in the top of this chart. Now, how does that relate to real numbers? So 1.4 mites per leaf is the threshold, is 38% of leaves infested. If we compare that back to what Frank Zalem and others determined in 1984, they said 43.6. So two completely different methods of very good research. We're talking 35 years apart. Both showed this exact same number, that treatments are not needed unless you have 40% of the leaves infested. Up to that point, you're fine. So what about the thrips? So the six-spotted thrips are specialized to eat mites. They're very adapted to do that, thrive in hot conditions. Most of them are females, they lay lots of eggs. We know they can double their population every 4 days. So excellent biocontrol organism. So we developed this trapping system here. You take a card called a yellow strip trap. Actually, a new name for it's a predator trap. We get them from Great Lakes IPM. You hang them in an orchard, leave them there for a week, and you count the thrips. On the right-hand side, you can see some far out and some close-up pictures of what the thrips look like. The bottom right picture shows you why they're called six-spotted thrips. That's because of those 6 spots on the wings. Now, we've done a lot of work with these traps, thousands of measurements. And what we determined is, if you want to know how many mites you have, count the mites. But if you want to know how many mites there are going to be, count the thrips. If you look at this chart, you can see on the bottom, this is the thrips to mite ratio. When the thrips to mite ratio is 0, okay, all the way left on the chart, mites increase exponentially. And that's what the y-axis is. The higher the number shows the more increase. To the contrary, as the thrips to mite ratio goes to infinity, meaning there's a ton of thrips per mite, the mite population decreases exponentially. This is that exact same chart, just on a log scale. And what this shows is that if you have 0.4 thrips per card for every 1 mite per leaf, the mite population won't change. Okay, 0.4 per card per week for every 1 mite per leaf. Now, I realize you're not counting mites and you may not be counting thrips, but what does that mean in the real world? Okay, so during May spray timing, first bullet here, okay, we know you're not supposed to treat if you have less than 40% of leaves infested, 1.4 per leaf. That's the threshold, so you shouldn't be treating before that. But if you look at 1.4 per leaf and you do the math from the preceding slide, that says if you're finding 0.6 thrips per card, there's no need to treat. So in other words, if you're finding at least 1 thrips on a card in April and May, and you're below that treatment threshold of 40% leaves infested, you now have doubly confirmed reason not to put on a May spray. And by the way, we've done over 20 orchards over the last 3 or 4 years now monitoring thrips. 100% of those orchards had well over 1 thrips per card. You can see the chart here from, this is from 9 sites over the last 2 years in the Southern and Central Valley. And we were getting up to 20 to 60 thrips per card per week during that April and May time, with the averages being well over 1. So, what we're finding is there is no longer a need for May sprays. Okay, it's just not there. Every time we try them, there's no real benefit of them. The only exception I'll say is a May spray might be needed if you plan on killing the thrips. Okay, so if you're going to go with a big gun pyrethroid for leaf-footed bugs or something, a May spray for mites might be justified. But outside of the scenario where you're killing your biocontrol, May sprays need to be a thing of the past. They're just not justified because growers are not getting to 40% of leaves infested, and the thrips are well above the levels needed to keep the mites in check. Now, what about hull split timing? So what's happening here is that we've got the same threshold, 40% leaves infested, but realize there's a lot of logistics to get in the way. So we got free rides you're trying to hit with Naval Orangworm sprays. We know there's pre-harvest and over issues. Oftentimes you're going to hit a threshold during harvest when you can't do anything about it. Okay, so here's what I want to say with that. Black line on the chart is the mites, dotted line on the chart is the thrips. We see this pattern over and over and over again, and there's about a 2-week lag time. That thrips population doubles every 4 days. So in order to give you a simplified model, because we know you're not going to be counting all the thrips on the cards and all the mites on the leaves in the middle of hull split, okay, not possible. But we did some probability tables. And what that showed is, on the 2 bullets on the bottom left, if you had 3 thrips per card, there was no change in mite density in 14 days. Okay, so I've taken the mites out of the equation, just looking at cards. 3 per card, no change in mites in 14 days. So that same number at 3 per card, the mites were lower 70% of the time in those orchards after 14 days. And in the orchards that weren't in that 77%, the 23 other percent, mites did not go off the chart. They were up a tiny bit, and by 21 days, they were down. So we're recommending this 3 per card as a nice threshold that just says, if you're in that hull split and beyond category, and you're seeing some mites and you're thinking, do I need to spray or not? I'm just telling you, if you're finding 3 per card on the thrips, walk away. You do not need to treat. Okay? If you're at a treatment threshold and you're not seeing thrips on the card, absolutely, that's justification for a miticide, and there's lots of options available. Okay, just to finish up in the last 2 minutes here. So actually, I just have one slide. And that's on stink bugs. I don't have a lot of information on management. I just want to say, watch out for them. What's happening within the almond industry is the dormant sprays are going away. The pyrethroids are there's less of those. The organophosphates are pretty much gone. Stink bugs used to be controlled by those, and they're starting to come back. So they're hard to find. They're often in the tops of the trees. Sometimes they'll migrate in the middle of season. You'll get pest control advisors that are looking diligently for leaf-footed bugs in April, May, and maybe the beginning of June, and kind of stop looking for bugs because leaf-footed bug season's over. And then maybe you have a cornfield, silage cornfield that gets harvested next to you, or a tomato field or something, and these stink bugs come in. Okay, they can cause damage into June with relatively hardened off shells that causes a black spot on the nut that's reject at harvest. That gummosis they cause, you see in the middle picture, is very evident early in the season. That picture is from about April. But when the stings occur in June and later, there's very, very little gummosis, and you just don't see it very easily. But if you suspect some leaf-footed or some stink bug damage, please work with your huller. Hopefully your huller is separating worm damage from black spot or bug damage for you. That's very important. If you're just getting one inedibles number, ask them for more details, because nobody wants to get 5% damage and think it's all Naval Orangworm, but find out 4% of that is with stink bugs. So please watch out for that. Talk to your PCA about that. If you've had black stains on your fruit in the past, be more diligent the next year, take care of it. And then last comment, we do know brown marmorated stink bugs in the almond industry in California is still a relatively small area. Most of the damage tends to be on ends of the fields. But I'm just going to say Jalinda Rajal, others are working on that. The Almond Board's funding research on that. So stay tuned for more information in the future. So with that, thank you very much. I appreciate the time this morning and the opportunity to virtually give this presentation. Last slide here. Just a last thank you. Just want to let you know the funding for pretty much everything that I've shown you today was funded by either the Almond Board over the last decade, or a grant from the California Department of Pesticide Regulation. So thank you very much. We could not have done this work without you.
Thank you very much for the invitation today to speak at the Almond conference. My name is Mohammed Yagmour, and today I'm going to talk about the IPM tools to manage hull rot and few tips in regards to managing this disease. So hull rot is the disease when the hulls of the almond get infected with the pathogens, mainly Rhizopus and Aspergillus, and the third one is Monolingual. So when the hull get infected, the disease progress, and the leaves, as you can see here on the left side of the picture, the leaves start to dry and shrivel. So those are the symptoms of the hull rot. Also, it's important to know our pathogens that cause this disease. Monolingual species is one of them. Rhizopus, stolonifer, and Aspergillus, they are also others that are mainly here in the San Joaquin Valley. Monolingual, we find it mainly in the Sacramento Valley in the northern part of the state. Before I get into the best strategies in using IPM to manage this disease, it's always important to understand the biology of the disease. And by that, I mean the main factors that contribute to this disease. Knowing those will make it much easier on us to use strategies that will prevent or minimize the negative effect of this disease. So, for example, of strategies we use in IPM are avoidance, where we avoid to grow in an area where is known to have the disease. Exclusion, we are mainly dealing with the pathogen, and we are trying to exclude the pathogen from entering the areas where we grow. And eradication pretty much is eliminating the pathogen and trying to completely remove it, such as removal of the primary Neculum. However, those major strategies really don't work when it comes to hull rot. So what's left is the fourth major strategy, which is protection. And what we mean by protection is the use of cultural practices as well as chemical control, alongside with sometimes host resistance if it is available, or at least understand the varietal differences in this case. So, as I mentioned earlier, in understanding the disease biology, it's always important to understand the sources of inoculum and where this source of spores are in the orchard. For example, when we are dealing with Monolingual, that also causes brown rot of stone fruits in general. So the sources of inoculum is infected almond and stone fruit twigs, as well as fruits and the mummies. That's why later on, when we are talking about the sanitation, or if you hear about sanitation, it's not only important for the Naval Orangworm, but also can reduce the source of inoculum for Monolingual species. Rhizopus stolonifer and Aspergillus niger, the source of inoculum is in the soil. So that's why it's important to note that, you know, the spores are carried on soil particles, and when we have dust, as you can see here on the left side in the picture, where a grower started shredding the pruning at the end of July in coincidence with hull split, causing quite a bit of hull rot. So, and that we have shown clearly in our previous work, where washed several fruits where we collected the dust on the surface of fruit, and we could isolate it by plating the wash on a medium, showing the Aspergillus and the Rhizopus are present on the fruit surface during hull split. Also, the other part, it's important to know when the fruit is susceptible to hot rot. Previous work by Dr. Jamal Scavage had showed clearly that when we are talking about Rhizopus stolonifer, the B2 stage, which also we regard to it as the deep V, is the most susceptible stage. When it comes to Aspergillus niger, our work have shown that the most susceptible one is the stage when the fruit is already open and less than 1 centimeter. Okay. However, also it's worth noting that the DV stage showed also higher incidence compared to unsplit one. Why we are looking at the most susceptible stage, the important part here is it's important to understand that, you know, Aspergillus and Rhizopus are wound pathogens. So the hull split stage is the most susceptible one when it comes to those two pathogens. And thus, if we are using chemical control, we have to know that this is the stages that we would like to protect from the fungus. When we are looking at also varietal differences, it's important to know that nonpareil, which in many areas here in California can be 50% of certain orchards. So to protect this very susceptible variety is very important. Other highly susceptible varieties are Butte and Winters. Sonora, for a good example, is a medium susceptibility. And the reason why we care about this information is to look in the future when we are designing an IPM strategy, whether the grower will go ahead and protect those varieties is a priority or not. So moving on, we also know that increased nitrogen fertilization have caused increased in hot rot disease incidence and increased in severity. And that work was done by Sebastian Sa, and had showed clearly that over-fertilization with nitrogen is going to increase the disease. So knowing all that information that I just mentioned to you put us in a good position to put integrated pest management tools for hot rot. And that should include both cultural and chemical. And when we are talking about cultural, we are talking about irrigation management and the nitrogen management. And when we are talking about chemicals, as I'm going to show later on, we are talking about the use of fungicides as well as the use of other chemicals such as alkaline fertilizers. So in short, previous work had clearly showed that regulated deficit irrigation will reduce the incidence and the severity of this disease significantly. So it's always important to implement irrigation management when we are talking about hot rot. And when we are talking about irrigation management, when we are talking about deficit irrigation, the most important thing is to note the end point. What we want really is to have the trees mildly stressed when we are using a pressure chamber, that the trees will be between -14 and -18 bars for 2 weeks, starting from approximately 1% hull split. So that will require the grower to start cutting on the water earlier, and it's advised to start cutting the water by 10 to 20% from the amount added but keeping the frequency as is. So if the grower is irrigating 3 times, then the grower will keep irrigating 3 times. What this will happen, how this will help the growers, it will help the growers in 2 ways. One, it will increase hull split uniformity, and thus give us a good way to protect most of the fruits when we are applying chemical control. The other one, it will reduce hull rot, as I mentioned earlier. When it comes to nitrogen management, it's always important to stick to our nitrogen management plan based on the yield and the expected yield, and not to over fertilize. So when we are talking about chemical control of hull rot, previous work that was done extensively by Dr. Jim Adscavage had shown clearly, when we are talking about Rhizopus stolonifer, that frac groups number 3, 11, and 19, they give us a good and reliable control of hull rot. Also, Dr. Jim Adscavage had showed clearly that the use of alkaline fertilizers such as dicap and Sanitation also were as effective as using the fungicides. So here we have good tools to use. I have worked at looking at the Aspergillus niger, and Dr. Themis Michailidis also looked at it in vitro. I looked at it in the field, and we have shown that group number 3 and the groups number 11 combined had showed good efficacy. So when we look at the end picture of managing hull rot, okay, it's really important to remember that we need to understand our causal agents, because based on the causal agent, it will decide what chemicals to use. For good example, and when to apply it. For a good example is when we are dealing with Monolingual, we have to apply the chemical 3 to 4 weeks before when we're applying the chemicals to Rhizopus. That's one. Dust management is really important. We know that pathogens such as Rhizopus and Aspergillus, they go to the canopy on soil particles. So reducing the dust will reduce the incidence of that pathogen reaching the canopy and being deposited on the fruits during hull split. Understanding varietal differences in terms of susceptibility, it's important. For a good example, when a grower has 50% of the orchard as nonpareil, then the grower will take a decision to protect the nonpareil. However, if another 25% of the orchard is Sonora, then the grower may take another step to protect and do another application just to protect the Sonora, since we know that Sonora have a medium susceptibility. When it comes to nitrogen management, we understand that it's important not to over fertilize, and also it's always important to remember that regulated deficit irrigation is one of the most important tools we can here deploy against this disease. Thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to hearing any questions you have to me. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Dr. Jim Adscavage, and I'm with the University of California in the Department of Microbiology and Plant Pathology at UC Riverside. I do a lot of research in almonds, and so today I'd like to present to you this presentation, Predicting Alternaria Leaf Spot, ALS, of almond using the DSV model. And the second part of the talk is how to integrate cultural practices in fungicide programs for managing ALS. One of the foundations of plant pathology is the disease triangle. So we have a susceptible host, conducive environment, and the pathogen. And it's when the interaction of these three come together, we form a triangle, as you can see in the lower left. If the three components are not overlapping or not interacting, in other words, if there's no pathogen, if the environment is not conducive, there's no disease results. So Alternaria leaf spot of almond is caused by the fungal pathogens Alternaria alternata and Alternaria arborescens. Now these two fungi are very closely related, and we just refer to them as Alternaria. They're ubiquitous fungi in orchards, and you can see with some of the symptoms, early symptoms show marginal infections, and then as we move to later infections, we see lesions over the entire leaf, and then even the later stages, they start turning black with sporulation of the fungus. In the lower left, you can see the conidia of Alternaria, which are dark, and that's what gives it the black coloration on the leaf lesions. Those spores are airborne. They're blown around, and they could end up contaminating the surfaces of other leaves that are healthy. And this process is repeated, and we can get infection on the leaves, and you can get defoliation, which is something almond growers and the almond industry does not want to have in the middle of summer. So Alternaria leaf spot of almond, what we're trying to do is understand the biology and epidemiology of the pathogen. As I pointed out, it's a ubiquitous fungus. So when we're thinking about the disease triangle, we always have the inoculum present, and we have a susceptible host. This crop, almond, is susceptible, but there are many other tree crops, from citrus to stone fruit to pomegranates and palm fruit, that can get Alternaria infections. So for the leaf phase, we're concerned with, since we have the inoculum, since we have the trees that are susceptible, we're looking really closely for leaf infections that will result when the environmental conditions are conducive. What are those conditions? Warm temperatures, high humidity, and frequent dews are the key that help to establish those, bring the disease, those three components into the disease triangle. So what else do we need to know? Well, we need to know that if we're going to monitor leaf wetness where the dew is settling, we have machinery, and this is a data logger, and we have sensors called leaf wetness sensors, and they need to be positioned on the shoulder of the canopy of the tree. And then the lower right, you can see usually that means that you have to get up on a ladder and position those leaf wetness sensors right on the shoulder as shown in the image. So how do we use this information? So identifying leaf spot infection periods and optimizing timing of fungicides. So what we're using is we use a modified DSV model. This model is developed for Alternaria on tomatoes, black mold of tomatoes, and we modified that to match what happens in an almond orchard with Alternaria leaf spot. So the microclimate in that orchard is really critical. And so some orchards will have become very conducive for disease. And again, the pathogen's omnipresent, and we have a susceptible host, the almond tree itself. So what we do is we use this model. We keep track of leaf wetness duration on a daily basis, and we keep track of temperatures. And I have it both in Celsius and Fahrenheit. So whatever you're comfortable with, we can keep track of the amount of leaf wetness. So you can see right away, 0 to 6, 0 to 2, at all these different temperatures of leaf wetness hours results in no DSV values, 0. If we end up with different amounts as temperature increases, we see that 7 to 15, 4 to 8, or 3 to 5 hours of leaf wetness in the second column will result in a DSV index value of 1. And again, if there's longer wetness periods of 16 hours, 9 to 15 hours, and so forth for the different temperatures, we end up with a DSV index value of 2. Well, you can see that these values go up, and if it's wet 24 hours in a day, well, then you get a DSV value of 4. So you keep track of these things daily, and you could graph these out as I have. And so the disease severity values, or DSV, is a function of leaf wetness and temperature, as I just illustrated. And the fungicides can be applied based on when you choose a threshold value. In this case, in this model that I'm representing here, I use a threshold of 6. So what we do is we keep track of the accumulated daily hours of the DSV model indexes. And so you can see in the lower left, I started in April 1st, and you can see we go through and there's no index value, so it's all 0. And then we start accumulating. This DSV value went up to 6, somewhere around 4.7, and then it kept going. It went up to about 11 on 4.9, and again a slightly higher on 4.10. Well, based on this, we would apply a fungicide timing when we reached past the threshold of 6. So on day in this example, on day 7, when it went to 6, we would say, well, it's time to put a fungicide application out. And we would do that where it's shown with this arrow. Then we would continue to monitor that and then wait for another major increase. So here on 4.28, another increase value of 6 points went up for the DSV model on between days 6 and the 28th and 29th. It went up to 6 on the DSV value. So here's another timing for the application. So we're basically timing our fungicides. We have a 3-week residual activity of the fungicides, and that's when there's only dew. And when there's rainfall, the residual activity is about 7 to 14 days. So you select the threshold values based on the type of intensity of a program that you want to have. The lower the number means you're going to be spraying more in that threshold. The higher the number means you're not going to spray until you get to these higher numbers, so you'll have less sprays. Most people use a threshold of 6. So there are many fungicides. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but there are many new fungicides that we're developing, and these in the last 3 years from we have Helmstar, Fervent, Sevia, Regev, and Miravis Top in 2021. These represent different modes of action, as we see with these circle charts, and these are the frac numbers that correspond to them. Our goal is to use, if we have to put more than one spray on, is to use these things in rotation between the different modes of action, or different frac numbers, these represented by these circle charts. So we're helping to develop new tools, and the goal is we would identify the materials that we would want to use. We say we start with Quadris Top, and then maybe we want to go to PhD, and then we end up with Quash. This would be an example of a rotating between 3 different modes of action. So if we look at some efficacy data, the fungicide programs for managing Alternaria here in 2018 in Colusa County on Carmel, what we used the model, and the model called for a spray on 5/16, and then we waited, and then about a month later on 6/14, a second spray was called for by the model, and we applied these fungicides, testing the fungicides and the timing of these fungicides on the incidence and severity of Alternaria leaf spot. Now, the rest of the summer, we kept monitoring it, and there was no need to apply an additional spray. And so as we ended up, when we read the disease in early September, we had about 60% disease in our control incidence. That's a percentage of the leaves that we collected had spots or no spots of Alternaria. And then the severity rating is rated from 0 to 4. And again, you can see it's right around a little bit more than 1. So that means about 25% of the infected leaves were diseased. And so we could identify, you see there was a lot of fungicide. This is low disease pressure. And so the fungicides performed very well. We have a number of fungicides circled here in red that were high performance. Quadris Top was one of the best with the different statistical groupings here. From the control is an A, so Quadris Top's an E. It's one of the best treatments available with less than 20% disease and an index value of less than 0.25. So this represents a highly successful treatment with a 2-spray program to manage Alternaria leaf spot. For the efficacy of these fungicides in a different year where there's really high disease pressure, here in 2020, just this past year, we started with the first application the model called for was on 5/13 or May 13th, a second application on 6/3, and a third application on 6/24, using the model at the threshold of 6, as I explained earlier. And so again, now this year we had much more intense disease. The incidence is nearly 100% when we read the disease early in September. You can see the severity is a 3. That means 75% of the infected leaves were covered with the disease. And we also had a defoliation. We rated trees, and again, a level almost of 2.5 to 2 represents about 45% defoliation in the orchard. So for that control treatment. And so again, we look at these, there's some fungicides under these high disease pressure performed better. So I circled these in red again. We had Quash and this new fungicide, Sevia, where again had a little bit of a high incidence, you might say, but the severity was low and the defoliation was low. So we had other materials like this new material, numbered compound UC2, as well as programs where we're rotating Sevia, Maravan, and PhD. Again, reduced the incidence from the control, had some of the lowest severity, and again, very low defoliation. A second program that we tested was Fontellus, Quash, and PhD, and you can see again, a very effective program, reducing the incidence significantly from the control, reducing the severity, and again, reducing the defoliation towards the end of the summer, beginning of the fall. So our goal with these fungicides is to push the disease progress curve across from the early part of the season, getting defoliation possibly without fungicides in July, and then to getting defoliation in October, November, when the trees are going to naturally lose their leaves. The fungicides that we've identified as effective are shown on the right. They're represented by FRAC codes 2, 3, 7, 9, 11, and 19. And then we use these FRAC codes to tell our timing in the efficacy tables on the UC IPM website. We're starting about 5 weeks after in the southern San Joaquin County, and then southern San Joaquin counties of the Central Valley. And we're looking at applications in April, May, and June with the different modes of action as I listed here. Again, these things is a little bit different from insects, managing insects. We have to put on these treatments preventatively. So if you have a history of the disease, if you have a known history of being in an orchard location that's positive for the conducive conditions that favor the disease, then these timings and using the model can be used to put on preventative treatments to protect the trees before the symptoms start to develop. So that's the plan with this program. One last thing about cross resistance. We've been able to show that these SDHI fungicides are very effective, and when there's no mutations in the targeted succinate dehydrogenase gene, all the fungicides work really well. These are all fungicides within the SDHI group. If we have a mutation, for example, in the SDHB subunit of that gene at this location 277, you can see that confers resistance to boscalid. If we have a mutation in the gene, the C subcomponent of that gene at the 134 location, that'll convey resistance to pyraziflumid, boscalid, and flexopyrazad, and whereas the pidiflumetophin, fluopyram, and isofetamine have low resistance potential with that mutation at that subunit C of the succinate dehydrogenase gene. So that's important if we're going to prevent cross resistance. We want to use these isofetamine, fluopyram, and pidiflumetophin as part of our selection of the materials that are less likely to develop resistance to this group of fungicides. So how do we manage Alternaria leaf spot? You can't just do it with fungicides. You have to use an integrated approach. And so right beginning with orchard design and cultivation, things that improve air movement. When you're setting up the orchards, these things can be planted further apart, the rows. The trees could be hedged and pruned appropriately to allow prevailing winds to go through the orchard. Row orientation usually is with the prevailing winds in the valley, and that's usually north and south. And then clean cultivation on the orchard floor to reduce humidity. Fertilization is another big component, reducing your nitrogen levels with no applications after early part of May, and again, keeping a balanced nutrition in the tree will help to maintain the tree vigor. Water is a big component, as I pointed out, with dews, and so how you irrigate your orchard is also very critical, and how long that water stays on the surface. If you have water penetration problems, that'll also increase the humidity in the orchard and subsequent dews that might form as we go through the season. So fungicide use is an effective tool when it's used in an integrated program. And using the DSV model set for a threshold, say, of 6 is an effective way to limit your number of sprays and to get the maximum number of disease reduction in disease. So we have good fungicide materials we've identified by these FRAC groups, and we've identified that there is concern with FRAC code 7 for potential resistance. So we've identified the isofetamid, fluopyram, and pidiflumethofen as having the lowest potential for resistance within that group. If we put all these things together, we should have a very highly effective Alternaria leaf spot control and using minimal amounts of fungicides, which results in a minimal input of cost and a maximum of yield and potential financial benefits from growing almonds. I'll stop there, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks, Jim, David, and Mohammed. As usual, an amazing depth and knowledge and experience behind what you've explained to us in terms of pest management tips. Just a reminder, if you have any questions, continue to put them into the chat box. The presenters will be available until noon to address those questions. They may also be available afterwards in the lounge for further conversation. For the CEU credits, please complete the quiz and any additional evidence of participation per the instructions. Up next are the closing remarks from 12 to 12:30. However, the trade show floor remains open all day with live folks until 2 p.m. The lounge also and the Almond Board booth are all open. And for those of you interested in learning more about the research or getting some more details on the research program, either check out the Research Updates 2020 in the Exhibits tab, or go to the Almond Board booth, and there you can actually download the whole research update and peruse the whole research program at your own leisure. That again, thank you to the speakers for taking the time, and thank you for attending the Almond Conference 2020.